In this episode, we're going to take compensating controls and make them feel like a disciplined, defensible tool rather than a last-minute escape hatch. For beginners, compensating controls can sound like a way to get around a requirement, and that misunderstanding can lead to sloppy reasoning that collapses when someone reviews the assessment. In reality, compensating controls exist because real environments sometimes have constraints that prevent a requirement from being met exactly as written, and the ecosystem needs a way to manage risk responsibly in those situations. The key is that compensating controls are not about lowering the bar. They are about meeting the same security objective through a different set of safeguards with a high burden of proof. When you manage them correctly, you protect the credibility of the assessment and the organization's security posture at the same time. By the end, you should be able to explain what compensating controls are when they are appropriate and how a QSA evaluates them so they stand up under scrutiny. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is defining the idea clearly, because a fuzzy definition creates fuzzy decisions. A compensating control is an alternative control or set of controls that is used when a requirement cannot be met as stated, but the organization can still achieve the intent of the requirement through other means. The concept depends on equivalence, meaning the alternative safeguards must provide a level of protection that is comparable to what the original requirement was trying to accomplish. That is very different from a partial fix, where the organization does some of what was required and hopes it is good enough. It is also different from simply accepting risk without controls, because compensating controls are still controls, not excuses. For a qualified security assessor, QSA, the job is to evaluate whether the alternative truly reduces risk in a way that aligns with the requirement's purpose. That evaluation is evidence-driven and conservative, because if you accept weak compensating controls, you are effectively weakening the standard. Managing compensating controls correctly means treating them as serious security engineering and serious assessment reasoning, not as paperwork. It also helps to understand why compensating controls are treated as special, because that explains why the expectations are strict. The defined approach in a standard requirement is the normal path, and it is predictable for reviewers and relying parties because it is widely understood. When an organization cannot meet that path, the natural risk is that exceptions become a slippery slope, with every difficult requirement relabeled as impossible. Compensating controls are the formal mechanism to prevent that drift by setting a higher bar for justification and evidence. In other words, compensating controls exist to allow flexibility without creating loopholes. This is why a QSA should expect to see a clear explanation of the constraint that prevents compliance, a clear explanation of what risk the requirement addresses, and a clear demonstration that the alternative controls address that same risk. If any of those elements is missing, the compensating control argument becomes fragile. A strong assessor mindset is to treat compensating controls as a rare and carefully justified option, not as a routine strategy. To manage compensating controls the right way every time, you need a repeatable mental sequence that keeps you from jumping straight to acceptance. First, you clarify the exact requirement and what it is trying to achieve, because you cannot evaluate an alternative if you are not clear on the security objective. Next, you confirm the organization's claim that the requirement cannot be met, because sometimes what is presented as impossible is really inconvenient or expensive. Then you identify the specific risk created by not meeting the requirement as written, because compensating controls must address that risk directly, not indirectly. After that, you evaluate the proposed alternative controls, looking for whether they provide comparable protection, whether they are sustainable, and whether they are measurable through evidence. Finally, you document the logic clearly, because documentation is part of defensibility, not just record keeping. When you follow this sequence, you reduce the chance of being persuaded by confidence or urgency. You also make it much easier to explain your decision to someone who was not present during the assessment. A major beginner misunderstanding is confusing compensating controls with the customized approach, because both involve alternative methods. The customized approach is a recognized way to meet a requirement objective through a different design, and it is often planned intentionally as part of the environment's architecture. Compensating controls are typically used when the requirement cannot be met and an alternative set of safeguards is proposed to cover the gap, often because of a constraint that the organization cannot remove quickly. The difference matters because compensating controls often carry a heavier sense of exception, and they require you to show that the reason for the exception is valid and that the alternative truly compensates. Another misunderstanding is thinking compensating controls mean you can substitute a weaker control because you have other good controls elsewhere. That is not compensation. That is wishful balancing, and it tends to fail under review because it does not prove equivalence to the specific risk the requirement addresses. The safest mindset is to treat compensation as precise and requirement-specific, not as a general claim that the environment is secure overall. When you keep these distinctions straight, your evaluations become cleaner and your decisions become easier to defend. The constraint explanation is one of the most important pieces because it establishes whether a compensating control is even justified. A strong constraint explanation is specific, verifiable, and tied to real limits, such as technical limitations of a legacy system, contractual limitations that cannot be changed immediately, or operational realities that make an exact requirement infeasible in the short term. A weak constraint explanation is vague, like saying the requirement is too hard or too disruptive, because that is not a constraint, it is a preference. A QSA should be comfortable challenging vague explanations, not in a hostile way, but in a professional way that asks for clarity and evidence. If the organization can meet the requirement with reasonable effort, then the defined requirement should be met, not compensated. If the organization truly cannot meet it, that should be demonstrable through facts. This matters because the integrity of compensating controls depends on them being used only when appropriate. When you accept compensating controls without a real constraint, you normalize exceptions and undermine the standard's value. Once the constraint is clear, the next discipline is defining the risk and the security objective in a way that is not generic. Many requirements exist because they reduce specific threat paths, such as preventing unauthorized access, reducing exposure windows, or limiting data handling in insecure places. Your compensating control must address those same threat paths, not just improve security in an unrelated area. For example, if a requirement is meant to prevent unauthorized administrative access, an alternative control that improves vulnerability, scanning, might be helpful overall, but does not directly compensate for the missing access control. This is where beginners often slip because they see two good security ideas and assume one can replace the other. In assessment logic, replacement requires equivalence to the objective, not just general improvement. The safest way to think is to name the threat event the requirement is preventing, then ask whether the alternative controls prevent that event or detect it quickly enough to reduce risk comparably. If the answer is unclear, the compensating control is not yet standing up. Evidence strategy becomes especially important with compensating controls because you are asking a reviewer to accept something that is outside the standard pattern. Strong evidence typically needs to show both design and effectiveness, meaning you can explain how the alternative controls work, and you can also demonstrate that they are operating reliably. If the alternative relies on monitoring and response, you need evidence that monitoring is actually tuned to detect the relevant events and that response is timely and consistent. If the alternative relies on restricting access in a different way, you need evidence that the restriction is real and that exceptions are controlled. Interviews and policy statements can support the story, but the center of gravity should be observable artifacts and records that demonstrate operation. A QSA should also look for whether evidence covers time, because a compensating control that was enabled yesterday does not prove sustained risk reduction. The more exception-like the control is, the more you want evidence that it is maintained deliberately rather than accidentally. Bulletproof evidence is what prevents compensating controls from becoming a paper shield. Another practical way to manage compensating controls well is to examine how they behave when something goes wrong, because weak compensating controls often fail under stress. If a compensating control depends on a person performing a manual review, you need to know what happens when that person is absent, busy, or replaced. If it depends on a process, you need to know how the process is enforced, audited, and corrected when missed. If it depends on a technical control, you need to know what happens during outages, maintenance windows, or changes. This is not about imagining extreme disasters. It is about recognizing that controls must survive normal operational friction. A compensating control that works only on good days is not compensating. A QSA evaluates resilience by looking for evidence of consistency, oversight, and corrective action, because those are signals that the control is real and sustainable. Beginners sometimes focus on whether a control exists at one moment, but the right standard is whether it operates as a dependable safeguard over time. Documentation is often where compensating controls either become defensible or fall apart, and it is worth understanding why. A compensating control must be described clearly enough that an independent reader can understand the gap, the reason the gap exists, the risk created by the gap, and the exact safeguards that compensate for it. It also needs to state why those safeguards are equivalent to the requirement's intent, not just that they are present. Good documentation avoids vague language and avoids emotional persuasion, focusing instead on clear claims that can be supported by evidence. It should also define boundaries, because compensating controls often apply to specific systems or specific workflows, not to the entire environment. If documentation does not specify where the compensating control applies, it becomes ambiguous, and ambiguity invites challenge. A QSA should also ensure the documentation does not quietly expand into a permanent exception without review. Compensating controls should be treated as living decisions that must be reassessed as the environment changes and as constraints are removed. It is also important to manage stakeholder expectations, because compensating controls often create tension between what the organization wants and what the assessment can credibly support. Some stakeholders may view compensating controls as a negotiation tool, expecting that persuasive explanations should be enough. The QSA role requires a different posture, where persuasion is not a substitute for evidence, and where the goal is a defensible conclusion. A practical way to handle this is communicating early that compensating controls carry a higher proof burden, and that the organization will need to provide specific artifacts and operational evidence. This reduces last-minute conflict and reduces the temptation to accept weak controls due to time pressure. It also helps stakeholders understand that compensating controls are not an insult or a punishment, but a structured method for handling real constraints responsibly. When people understand the logic, they often become more cooperative, which improves evidence quality. Clear communication protects your integrity and it also protects the organization from investing effort into an approach that cannot be defended. From an exam perspective, compensating control questions often test whether you recognize the difference between a control that is merely helpful and a control that truly compensates for a specific requirement gap. Options that accept vague constraints, like cost or inconvenience, are usually weak because they do not justify an exception. Options that rely on broad security maturity claims without tying to the objective are also usually weak because they do not show equivalence. Strong options typically emphasize documenting the constraint, identifying the risk addressed by the requirement, implementing alternative controls that meet the same objective, and collecting evidence that demonstrates effectiveness over time. You may also see choices that suggest compensating controls are a routine way to handle any difficult requirement, and those are usually wrong because compensating controls should not become the default. The exam is rewarding disciplined reasoning, not creative excuse-making. When you keep the objective and evidence at the center of your thinking, the correct answers start to feel more obvious. Finally, managing compensating controls the right way every time also means understanding their life cycle, because the best compensating control decisions do not live forever unchanged. Constraints that prevent compliance can sometimes be removed through system upgrades, architecture changes, or contract revisions, and when that happens, the organization should move toward meeting the requirement as written or through a more standard approach. A compensating control can be an important bridge, but bridges are meant to connect you to a stronger destination, not to become the permanent road. A QSA should be attentive to whether compensating controls are being used responsibly as part of a plan, or whether they are being used to avoid improvement indefinitely. That does not mean you force unrealistic timelines, but it does mean you evaluate whether the organization is managing risk intentionally and transparently. When compensating controls persist, your evidence and documentation expectations should remain high, because the longer an exception exists, the greater the need for disciplined maintenance. Sustainable security is not just about one assessment cycle. It is about continuous risk management. To close, compensating controls are a legitimate and necessary part of PCI assessment work, but only when they are treated as a rigorous method for meeting the same security objective under real constraints. The right way every time begins with a clear understanding of the requirement's intent, a verified and specific constraint that explains why the requirement cannot be met, and a precise statement of the risk that must be addressed. It continues with alternative safeguards that directly compensate for that risk, supported by layered evidence that demonstrates real, sustained effectiveness. Strong documentation makes the logic transparent, and clear communication keeps expectations aligned so that time pressure does not drive weak decisions. In exam scenarios and real assessments, the winning mindset is disciplined equivalence, not convenience. When you practice that mindset, compensating controls stop feeling like a gray area and start feeling like a professional tool you can apply with confidence and integrity.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.